The day our divorce was finalized, my ex-wife wore a smirk so triumphant it seemed as though she'd just pulled off the heist of a lifetime. She walked away, convinced she had won, leaving me in the wreckage of our past. But 4 years later, we crossed paths again. And the moment she saw me, that cruel confidence vanished, and her entire reality shattered. It was a Tuesday in November, when Vanessa handed me the eviction notice for the Seattle townhouse we'd shared for 6 years. Her parents technically owned the deed, and she used that legal loophole to throw me out on the street with exactly 48 hours notice. I remember the weather. It was that relentless, sideways Seattle rain that gets under your collar and makes your bones ache. I was standing in the kitchen we had remodeled together, holding a piece of heavy stock paper that effectively erased my entire adult life. Vanessa didn't even have the decency to look uncomfortable. She stood by the marble island, sipping a green juice, wearing a beige cashmere sweater that cost more than my first car. Outside, idling in the driveway, was a black Audi SUV. Caden was behind the wheel. Caden, the guy she told me not to worry about. The guy who just really understood her vision for the future. She had already drained our joint savings. Exactly $34,200. I found out when my debit card declined at a gas station that morning. When I confronted her, she didn't flinch. She told me she was investing it in Caden's new luxury car rental business. She looked me dead in the eye and said I owed it to her for wasting her 20s. I was a line cook trying to work my way up, bringing home calluses and a modest paycheck. She wanted a lifestyle I couldn't provide. So, she took what little we had built, legally outmaneuvered me with her father's corporate lawyers, and gave me 2 days to cease existing in her space. I packed my clothes into 3 black garbage bags, hefty bags, the ones that smell like synthetic pine. That was it. 6 years of marriage reduced to plastic sacks. I loaded them into the back of my rusted 2008 Honda Civic and drove south. I moved into a damp basement room in Tacoma. It smelled like wet concrete and old laundry. The single window was ground level, looking out at the tires of parked cars. I slept on an air mattress that leaked. By midnight, my hips would hit the freezing linoleum floor. For weeks, I survived on instant ramen, peanut butter, and tap water. I took a job at a logistics firm routing freight trucks through the Cascades. I sat in a windowless room under humming fluorescent lights for 10 hours a day, staring at a dual monitor setup until my eyes burned. A few weeks later, the cold really set in. I was sitting on the deflated air mattress, unpacking a damp cardboard box of old tax files because I needed my social security card for the logistics company's HR department. I was sifting through 2019 tax returns and old utility bills when a sealed envelope fell out. It hit the floor with a soft slap. It was a formal letter from the Culinary Institute of America in New York, dated 4 years earlier. My chest tightened. I picked it up. The seal was unbroken, but the envelope looked worn, like it had been shuffled between folders. I carefully tore the edge. It was an acceptance letter. 4 years ago, I had applied in secret. I was terrified of rejection. When weeks turned into months and nothing came in the mail, I assumed I hadn't made the cut. I remember the exact day I gave up. I remember sitting on the edge of our bed, telling Vanessa that maybe I just wasn't meant to be a chef. Maybe I should just get a stable job. I remember how she stroked my hair and told me I was making the mature choice. She had intentionally intercepted it. She hid it in a dusty folder of old receipts and watched me abandon my dream because I truly thought I wasn't good enough. The profound sadness I'd been carrying for a month evaporated instantly. Pure, unadulterated rage took its place. A hot, blinding clarity. She hadn't just broken my heart. She actively sabotaged my future to keep me working a miserable, predictable job to fund her lavish lifestyle. She needed a steady paycheck to anchor her while she played at being a socialite. I didn't cry. I didn't punch a wall. I just folded the letter, put it in my wallet, and walked out of the basement. I quit my logistics job the very next morning. I didn't give 2 weeks' notice. I just left my badge on the supervisor's desk and walked out. I drove the Honda out to the Oregon coast, ignoring the knocking sound in the engine, all the way to a freezing little harbor town called Astoria. I parked by the docks, walked into the salt-sprayed air, and literally begged a captain for a job on a commercial crabbing boat. The captain's name was Thad. He looked at my soft city hands and laughed, but I stood there in the freezing rain and told him I wouldn't leave until he put me on the deck. He needed a bait boy. For 18 months, I hauled freezing pots out of the brutal Pacific Ocean on a rusted vessel called the Pharaoh. I worked grueling 20-hour shifts. The cold was a physical entity that tried to crack your bones. My hands bled, blistered, split open, and eventually, thick yellow calluses formed over the cuts. I smelled constantly of diesel fuel, rotting herring, and ocean brine. We worked in storms that pitched the deck at 45-degree angles. Men broke arms, lost fingers. I kept my head down and worked. Every paycheck went straight into a high-yield savings account. I spent my downtime, which was usually just a few hours between shifts, reading advanced culinary texts by flashlight in my tiny claustrophobic bunk. I read Harold McGee. I read about fermentation, about the cellular breakdown of proteins over open flame, about smoke profiles and salinity. I memorized flavor matrices while the Pacific slammed against the hull inches from my head. By year 3, I had saved exactly $85,000. It wasn't venture capital money, but it was mine, blood money. I drove back up to Seattle. The city looked different to me now. The gleaming glass towers didn't intimidate me. I spent weeks walking the waterfront until I found it, a tiny, abandoned boat repair shop tucked between 2 massive commercial piers. It was a wreck. The roof sagged, the floors were warped with sea rot, and it smelled of old oil. But it was right on the water, and the rent was dirt cheap because developers thought the footprint was too small to be profitable. I signed a 5-year lease. No wealthy investors, no massive bank loans, just me. I gutted the place myself. I reinforced the floors, ripped out the drywall to expose the original maritime brick, and built a massive, custom wood-fired grill in the center of the room. I named it Iron and Brine. My menu was brutally simple. The absolute freshest seafood on the West Coast, kissed by alder wood smoke, salt, and fire. I didn't do foams. I didn't do smears on plates. I took a whole Dungeness crab, roasted it over raw flames with fermented chili and garlic butter, and served it with charred sourdough. Word of mouth spread like wildfire. First the dock workers came, then the food bloggers, then the critics. A review in the Seattle Times called it a visceral masterpiece of smoke and sea. 6 months later, Iron and Brine had a 6-month waiting list. A year later, I received a James Beard nomination. I was working 80-hour weeks, but it was a different kind of exhaustion. It was the exhaustion of building an incredible empire that belonged solely to me. I bought a beautiful loft overlooking the Puget Sound. I upgraded my entire wardrobe, tailoring crisp chef coats and sharp civilian clothes, and for the first time in my life, I completely forgot Vanessa even existed in this world. Then came the exclusive investor summit. A prominent Seattle venture capital firm, Lock Capital, rented out my entire restaurant for a private closed-door dinner. They were evaluating pitches from desperate tech founders seeking Series B funding. It was a massive payday for the restaurant, but more importantly, the head of the firm, a billionaire named Arthur, had become a regular. Arthur liked my food, but he liked my story more. We had spent several late nights after service drinking scotch at the bar, talking about risk, failure, and leverage. It was a Tuesday night. The restaurant was closed to the public. The dining room was filled with the low hum of money, expensive suits, clinking crystal, the murmur of high-stakes negotiations. I was in the open kitchen, standing under the warm glow of the copper heat lamps, carefully plating a charred octopus appetizer. I was wiping the rim of the slate plate when I heard it. That unmistakable, shrill laugh. It echoed off the exposed brick walls, cutting through the ambient noise like a serrated knife. I froze. I looked up through the pass. Vanessa was standing by the mahogany bar, desperately trying to network with a group of bored-looking financial executives. She was holding a martini glass too tightly. Her expensive designer dress, a dark green silk number I recognized from years ago, looked slightly frayed at the hem. She looked thinner, sharper around the edges, radiating a frantic, nervous energy. I knew why. The industry gossip in Seattle is a small pond. Caden's luxury car rental business had famously imploded last year in a massive bankruptcy scandal. Turns out, he was running a Ponzi scheme with the fleet financing. It took all her stolen money, her credit score, and her social standing with it. She was here aggressively pitching a ridiculous culinary app, begging for a financial lifeline. I watched her for a moment, the woman who had thrown me away like garbage, the woman who had hidden my future in a box of old taxes. I wiped down my prep station. I handed my tongs to my sous chef. Imogen, take over the pass for a minute, I said quietly. I took off my stained apron, tossed it into the laundry bin, and walked straight into the private dining room. I didn't rush. I walked with the slow, heavy gravity of a man who owned the ground he stood on. I stopped merely inches from her table. She was mid-sentence, aggressively leaning toward a junior partner at Lock Capital, talking about synergistic food delivery metrics. She looked up, clearly annoyed at the interruption. Her eyes flicked over me, dismissing me as staff, before her brain actually registered my face. Then, the color completely drained from her pale cheeks. It was like watching a ghost possess a living body. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She stared at the pristine custom chef's coat, the embroidered iron and brine logo over my heart, the quiet authority in how I stood. She looked around the bustling, gorgeous space, the custom lighting, the wealthy patrons, the massive wood fire hearth blazing in the background, like she was trapped in a surreal nightmare. Elias? She whispered, her voice trembling like a dead leaf in the wind. Are you the owner? I didn't even blink. I didn't offer a polite smile. I just looked down at her. Before I could answer, Arthur walked over. He carried a tumbler of Macallan and threw his heavy arm around my shoulder. Vanessa, Arthur said sharply, completely ignoring her glossy pitch deck sitting on the high top table. I see you finally met Chef Elias. He's not just hosting us tonight. He's the newest voting partner on our hospitality investment board. Vanessa's jaw practically hit the hardwood floor. Her eyes darted frantically between Arthur and me. The martini glass in her hand shook so badly that a drop of clear liquor spilled over the rim and hit her knuckles. Partner? She choked out. That's right, Arthur smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Elias brings a ground-level operational perspective we desperately need. Actually, he's the one who will be reviewing the viability of your app's supply chain model. Arthur patted my shoulder and took a sip of his scotch. Excuse me, I need to go rescue David from the crypto guys. Arthur walked away, leaving us in a heavy, suffocating silence. The noise of the dining room seemed to fade into a dull roar. Vanessa stared at me. The panic in her eyes was raw and unvarnished. She looked down at her pitch deck, then back up at me. I could see the gears turning in her head, the desperate recalculation of power. 4 years ago, she had all the cards. She had her parents' townhouse, my savings, the Audi, the smirk. Now, she had a frayed dress and a doomed pitch, and I was the gatekeeper to her salvation. Elias, she started, her voice dropping an octave, trying to find that old familiar cadence she used to use when she wanted something. I had no idea. This place is incredible. You've done so well. Save it, Vanessa. My voice was flat. I felt no anger in that moment, just a cold, deep indifference. Enjoy your dinner. Try the octopus. I turned my back on her and started walking back toward the kitchen. I felt the heat of the wood fire washing over my face as I approached the swinging doors. It felt good, clean. I pushed through the doors, stepping back into the controlled chaos of the line. Imogen was calling out tickets. The smell of searing scallop and rendered duck fat filled the air. I took my spot at the pass, grabbed a clean towel, and got back to work. 20 minutes later, the rush slowed. I was standing in the small office tucked behind the walk-in cooler, checking inventory invoices on my laptop. The door was cracked open. A shadow fell across the threshold. Vanessa pushed the door open entirely and stepped inside. She closed it behind her until it clicked. The office was barely larger than a closet, smelling of printer ink and dried kelp. With her in it, the oxygen seemed to instantly deplete. You can't be back here, I said, not looking up from the screen. Insurance liability. Don't do that, she said. Her voice was tight, stripped of the fake networking gloss she had out on the floor. I finally looked up. She was gripping the strap of her purse so hard her knuckles were white. Don't do what? I asked. Don't play the cold, untouchable king. Not with me. She took a step closer to the desk. You know exactly what's riding on this pitch tonight. Caden left me with $500,000 in debt. Real debt, Elias, not credit cards. Private lenders. If Lock Capital doesn't bite on this app, I'm going to lose my parents' house. They leveraged it to bail me out of the first round of lawsuits. That sounds like a terrible financial decision, I said calmly. But it has nothing to do with me. You're a voting partner, which means I have a fiduciary duty to evaluate investments based on merit. Your app is a redundant food delivery aggregate with a bloated user acquisition cost. It's a bad pitch, Vanessa. Arthur knows it. He's just letting you present as a favor to your father. Her face tightened. The vulnerability she had tried to project shattered, revealing the familiar, sharp-edged entitlement beneath. You owe me this, she hissed. I actually laughed. It was a short, sharp sound. I owe you? You took my savings. You threw me onto the street in November. You hid my CIA acceptance letter. You stole my life, Vanessa. She flinched slightly at the mention of the letter, but recovered instantly. I made you. She snapped back. Look around. Look at this place. Look at you. You think you would have built this if I hadn't pushed you out? You would have been perfectly happy working in a mediocre kitchen for the rest of your life. I gave you the hunger. I did you a favor. I stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the concrete floor. I am not a small man, and the 18 months on the crabbing boat had put thick muscle across my shoulders that hadn't been there when we were married. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. Get out of my kitchen. again. She didn't move. A cold, desperate smile touched the corners of her mouth. You think you're untouchable now because you serve expensive crab to billionaires, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. But you missed something, Elias. You always were terrible with paperwork. I stopped. What are you talking about? She reached into her designer purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She didn't hand it to me. She just held it up. When we finalized the divorce, you signed the dissolution of assets in a hurry, she said. You just wanted it over with. You didn't read the addendums my father's lawyers drafted. I signed away the townhouse. I let you keep the 34 grand you stole. We had no other shared assets. It was clean. It was clean for the assets we held, Vanessa corrected, her eyes gleaming with a toxic mix of fear and triumph. But there was a clause regarding future commercial endeavors originating within a 5-year window of the dissolution, specifically designed to protect my investment in your culinary training. Training I paid for early in our marriage. I stared at her. The air in the tiny office suddenly felt thick. I never went to the CIA. You made sure of that. But I did pay for your regional certification courses, she countered smoothly. And under the terms you signed, I retain a 15% equity stake in any food service enterprise you establish before the 5-year statute expires. It's a standard non-compete offset. My father insisted on it. My mind raced, trying to recall the stack of legal documents I had signed on the hood of my rusted Civic outside the courthouse. I had been devastated, exhausted, and completely broken. I had just flipped to the back pages and signed on the sticky tabs. You're lying, I said, though a cold knot was forming in my stomach. Check with your lawyer, she said, finally dropping the paper onto my desk. It was a photocopy of a heavily redacted legal addendum, my rushed signature sitting plainly at the bottom. You opened Iron and Brine 3 years and 8 months after the divorce. You're well within the window. She leaned over the desk, her face inches from mine. So here's how this is going to work, Elias. You are going to go back out there, and you are going to tell Arthur that you've reviewed the back-end data for my app. You are going to tell him that as the new hospitality partner, you strongly advise a Series A injection of $2 million. Or what? I asked, my voice dangerously low. Or, I exercise my option, she whispered. I take 15% of Iron and Brine. I force a financial audit. I drag you into civil court, tie up your operational liquidity, and make sure every food critic in Seattle knows that the James Beard nominee is currently embroiled in a messy, asset-stripping lawsuit with his ex-wife. How do you think Arthur and Locke Capital will feel about their new partner being a legal liability? She straightened up, her smirk slowly returning. It was a fragile imitation of the one she wore the day she evicted me, cracked around the edges, but the venom was the same. I'll be at the bar, she said. I pitch in 20 minutes. Don't make me ruin you twice. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving a vacuum in the tiny office. The ambient noise of the kitchen, the clatter of pans, the hiss of searing fat, Imogen barking out fire times, was suddenly muffled. I stood there staring at the photocopy on my desk. The cheap toner ink was slightly smeared, but my signature was unmistakable. Rushed, sloppy, scrawled with a freezing hand on the hood of my rusted Civic outside the King County Courthouse. I didn't panic. Panic was a luxury you couldn't afford on a crabbing boat when the winch jammed, and you couldn't afford it on a Friday night when the printer spit out 20 tickets at once. You just worked the problem. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Bowen. Bowen was a regular who came in every Thursday for the raw oysters and a dry martini. He also happened to be a partner at a mid-sized corporate litigation firm in Belltown. He picked up on the third ring. Elias, please tell me you saved me a table, because I am currently starving. I need legal advice, I said, my voice dead flat. Right now, on a 5-year dissolution of assets clause involving future commercial equity. The playful tone dropped from Bowen's voice instantly. Read it to me. I picked up the paper and read the heavily redacted paragraph aloud. I stumbled over the dense legalese, but the core mechanism was clear. A non-compete offset, guaranteeing a 15% equity stake in any food service enterprise established within 5 years of the finalized divorce, in exchange for past educational investments. Who drafted this? Bowen asked, sighing heavily into the receiver. Her father's firm, Trask and Associates. Of course it was Trask. They love this kind of predatory garbage. Okay, listen to me, Elias. Did she actually pay for culinary school? No, she intercepted the acceptance letter. The only thing she ever paid for was a $300 food safety certification and a weekend knife skills workshop at a community college when we first started dating. Okay, Bowen said slowly. In a fair fight, a judge throws this out. The financial disparity between a $300 class and 15% of a restaurant doing your volume is absurd. It's unconscionable. So she has nothing. I didn't say that. Bowen's voice was grim. I said in a fair fight, but Trask doesn't do fair. If she exercises this option, they don't just file a claim. They file an emergency injunction to freeze your operating accounts while the equity is disputed. They'll argue you're a flight risk or that you might siphon profits to avoid paying her share. My stomach turned to lead. If my accounts are frozen, I can't pay my purveyors. I can't make payroll. Exactly. The restaurant chokes to death in 3 weeks. They know you don't have the runway to survive a protracted legal freeze. It's legalized extortion. They want you to settle. Or in this case, it sounds like she wants something specific from you right now. She wants a $2 million Series A from Locke Capital, the firm renting out my dining room tonight. I'm a voting partner on their hospitality board. She wants me to rubber stamp her pitch. Bowen whistled low. That is bold and highly illegal if it crosses into actual coercion, but proving it is another story. Elias, if you tank her pitch, she will file that injunction tomorrow morning. Can you stall her? She pitches in 15 minutes. Don't give her a hard no, Bowen advised. Play the middle. Ask for more time to review the data. Tell her you need a week. Give me a few days to draft a preemptive countersuit and find a judge who hates Trask. But whatever you do not antagonize her in front of the VC guys. She has nothing left to lose. People with nothing to lose are incredibly dangerous. Thanks, Bowen. I hung up. I looked at the photocopy one last time, then folded it neatly and put it in my pocket. I walked out of the office and back onto the line. The heat hit me like a physical wall. Imogen was plating a massive order of whole roasted branzino, her tweezers moving with practiced precision. I tied a fresh apron around my waist. You good, chef? Imogen asked, not looking up from the fish. You look like you just swallowed a stone. I'm fine. Hold the pass. I have to go play venture capitalist for a bit. I walked through the swinging doors into the dining room. The shift in atmosphere was always jarring, from the sweaty, high-octane trenches of the kitchen to the dim, velvet-lined serenity of the dining floor. The Locke Capital executives were seated around a massive, custom-built oak table we had pulled to the center of the room. The remains of the charred octopus and Wagyu tartare were being cleared by my front-of-house staff. Arthur caught my eye and gestured to the empty chair to his right. Elias, Arthur boomed, pouring another finger of scotch into his glass. Just in time. The tech guys bored me to tears with their blockchain supply chain nonsense. Let's talk food. Sit. I took the seat. Across the room, standing by a digital presentation board, was Vanessa. She had reapplied her lipstick. Her posture was rigidly perfect, but I could see the slight tremor in her hands as she queued up her first slide. She caught my eye. The smirk was gone, replaced by a cold, hard stare. A silent warning. Rubber stamp it, or lose everything. All right, Vanessa, Arthur said, leaning back and crossing his arms. You're up. Walk us through Gourmet Connect, and try to keep the buzzwords to a minimum. Chef Elias here doesn't care about your synergistic paradigms. He cares if the math makes sense on a loading dock. Vanessa took a deep breath. She clicked a remote, and the screen behind her lit up with a sleek, minimalist logo. Gourmet Connect, she began, her voice projecting with practiced, artificial warmth, is the answer to the modern culinary gap. We aren't just another delivery aggregate. We are a curated, subscription-based platform connecting high-net-worth individuals directly with private, off-menu dining experiences from top-tier local restaurants. She clicked to the next slide. It showed a hockey stick growth chart that I instantly recognized as pure, unadulterated fiction. Our beta test in the Bellevue area showed a 92% retention rate month over month, she continued. By taking a flat 20% commission on these exclusive, high-ticket orders, we bypass the razor-thin margins of standard food delivery. We are asking for $2 million in Series A to scale our logistics infrastructure and expand into Portland and San Francisco. She spent the next 10 minutes talking about user interfaces, VIP onboarding, and brand alignment. It sounded great if you knew absolutely nothing about the restaurant industry. The junior partners around the table were nodding thoughtfully. It was shiny. It sounded exclusive, but I knew the reality. I looked at the slide showing her projected logistics costs. The number was absurdly low. Vanessa, I said. The entire table went quiet. Arthur turned to look at me, a faint look of amusement playing on his lips. Vanessa's eyes locked onto mine. Her knuckles went white on the presentation remote. Yes, Elias, she said, her voice tight. Your beta test in Bellevue, you're claiming a 92% retention rate. That's correct, but your platform relies on transporting high-end, off-menu items from top-tier kitchens. Top-tier kitchens don't use standard clamshell takeout boxes because the food degrades instantly. A dry-aged ribeye sweating in a plastic container for 40 minutes isn't a premium experience. It's garbage. I kept my voice perfectly even, leaning forward slightly. So, you must be using specialized, climate-controlled transport vessels and white-glove couriers. Vanessa swallowed hard. Yes, our couriers are highly vetted. Right, but your projected logistics costs here, I tapped the table, are listed at $3.50 per mile. That barely covers standard gas and insurance for an amateur driver in a Honda Civic. It certainly doesn't cover a bonded courier, specialized hot box equipment, and the liability insurance required to transport high-ticket catering. Your logistics budget is off by at least 400%. A murmur rippled through the junior partners. The nodding stopped. Vanessa's face flushed a deep, ugly red. We have secured fleet partnerships that offer us bulk rate discounts. Fleet partnerships? I asked. Like a luxury car rental business? Arthur's eyebrows shot up. The bankruptcy of Caden's company was well known in these circles. The implication hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Vanessa actually took a physical step back, her heel catching slightly on the hardwood floor. Our current logistics model is fully sustainable, she forced out, her eyes blazing with absolute hatred. She looked at me, and I saw her hand drop to her purse resting on the stool next to the screen. I knew exactly what she was thinking. The contract. Arthur swirled his scotch. He has a point, Vanessa. You're selling a white glove service on a paper plate budget. If the food shows up cold, your high net worth clients churn out on day one, and I don't see any capital allocation here for the kind of cold chain transport Elias is talking about. Vanessa was drowning. She looked at me again, an unmistakable plea flashing beneath the anger. She was begging me to throw her a rope. If I said something mitigating, if I suggested that the logistics could be fixed with a bit more capital, Arthur would probably bite. I thought about the damp basement in Tacoma. I thought about the smell of rotting herring on the Faro. I thought about the 3 black garbage bags. Furthermore, I continued, ignoring her silent plea, no top-tier chef is going to give up 20% of a high-ticket item to an unproven app. Not when our margins are already squeezed by labor and ingredient costs. You don't have a supply problem, Vanessa. You have a supply impossibility. The only restaurants desperate enough to agree to those terms are the ones failing anyway, which ruins your exclusive branding. Arthur chuckled softly. Well, that's a rather definitive autopsy. Thank you, chef. He looked at Vanessa. I think we've seen enough, Vanessa. The numbers just aren't matching the reality of the floor. We're going to pass. Vanessa stood frozen. The screen behind her clicked into a screensaver, bathing her in a soft, mocking blue light. She had lost. The $2 million was gone. The parents' house, the debt, all of it was crashing down on her, right here in my dining room. She didn't pack up her presentation. She didn't say thank you for your time. She simply reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and typed something furiously. She hit send, shoved the phone back into her bag, and walked out of the restaurant without a single word, the heavy glass doors slamming shut behind her. Arthur sighed, standing up. Shame. Her father's a good lawyer, but she doesn't have the stomach for operations. All right, everyone. Let's take a 10-minute recess before we hear the real estate pitch. The table broke up, men in suits stretching their legs and checking their phones. I stood up, feeling a hollow sense of victory. I had burned her down, but Bowen's warning echoed in my head. They file an emergency injunction tomorrow morning. I started walking back to the kitchen, needing the heat, needing to work the line to clear my head. Halfway across the dining room, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. It wasn't a text from Bowen. It was an email. The sender was Richard Trask, Vanessa's father. I opened it. There was no text in the body of the email, just a PDF attachment. The file name was notice_of_filing_injunctive_relief_ironbrine.pdf. She hadn't waited for tomorrow morning. She had texted her father from the floor of the restaurant, and he had already pulled the trigger. They had electronically filed the paperwork with the night clerk at the county court. My operating accounts weren't going to be frozen next week. They were going to be frozen the second the banks opened at 9:00 a.m. tomorrow. I stared at the timestamp on the email, 8:42 p.m. Trask hadn't waited to see how the pitch went. The PDF was filed at 4:15 p.m. that afternoon. The text to her father was just the signal to send me the receipt. She had walked into my restaurant knowing she had a loaded gun pointed at my head regardless of what Arthur decided. If she got the money, she'd probably still squeeze me for the 15% out of pure spite. Since she didn't, this was her immediate retaliation. I put the phone back in my pocket and walked straight to the small pose terminal by the host stand. I checked our current liquidity. We had a healthy margin sitting in our primary Chase business account. Payroll was scheduled to auto-draft in 3 days. Vendor invoices, the seafood, the specialty farm in Skagit Valley for the produce, the linen service, were set to clear on Monday. If the injunction hit at 9 am, that money became a ghost. I went back to the office and picked up the phone. I bypassed Bowen and called my accountant, Hester. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who operated out of a messy office in Ballard. She picked up with the sound of a television blaring in the background. Elias, tell me you aren't calling about the quarterly tax forms because I'm watching Jeopardy. Hester, if a temporary injunction is placed on my business accounts at 9 am tomorrow, what happens to checks I cut tonight? The television muted instantly. An injunction? From who? My ex-wife's father. It's a long story. Just tell me about the checks. If they don't clear the receiving bank before the freeze hits your bank, they bounce. And if you start moving large sums of money electronically, right now, tonight, after receiving notice of a pending legal action, Trask will amend the filing to include fraudulent conveyance. They will accuse you of hiding assets. You'll give the judge a reason to make the temporary freeze permanent. I rubbed my eyes, pressing my fingers hard into my temples. So I can't touch my own money. You can touch it, Hester said, her voice dropping into a serious maternal register. But every penny you move from this second forward will be heavily scrutinized in discovery. How much physical cash do you have on hand? In the safe? Maybe 4,000. We're mostly cards. That's your operating budget until Bowen gets the freeze lifted. You don't pay yourself. You don't pay rent. You use that cash to buy whatever you absolutely need to keep the doors open this weekend. I'm assuming you have reservations? We're booked solid for the next 6 months. Then you better start getting creative with your vendors. Elias, don't play games with Trask. He's a shark. Do not wire money out of that account tonight. I hung up. $4,000. That wouldn't even cover my seafood order for Friday night service. I walked back out to the line. The venture capitalists were wrapping up their dinner. Arthur was laughing loudly at a joke someone made, signing a check that I desperately needed to clear before the morning. It felt like I was watching it happen from underwater. I caught Imogen's eye. She was meticulously labeling plastic quart containers of reduced veal stock for tomorrow's prep. Imogen, I need you to stay late, I said, keeping my voice low so it wouldn't carry across the dining room. We need to do a full inventory of the walk-in. Right now, I need to know exactly how many portions of every single protein we have in this building. She wiped her hands on her apron, sensing the immediate shift in my tone. Did someone screw up the order? No, we're just going to have to run lean this weekend. Leaner than we ever have. Once the last VC walked out the door and the heavy glass entrance was locked, the real work began. I pulled down the shades. My front of house manager, a sharp guy named Crispin, brought me the final tally for the night. The credit card receipts were substantial. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a great Thursday. Tonight, those receipts were just useless numbers on a screen that I wouldn't be able to touch for weeks. I went into the walk-in with Imogen. It was freezing, the hum of the massive industrial compressors loud enough to drown out the street noise outside. We counted every oyster, every fillet of halibut, every pound of crab. It smelled of brine and fresh earth. Usually, this smell grounded me. Tonight, it just made me anxious. It was grim. We prided ourselves on zero waste and maximum freshness, which meant we ordered daily. We didn't hoard frozen stock. We had enough seafood to get through maybe the first 2 hours of Friday dinner service. After that, we'd be 86ing half the menu. By 8 p.m., I'd have to start turning away people who had waited half a year for a table. Word would spread. The critics who had championed me would hear that Iron and Brine couldn't even manage its own supply chain. It was exactly what Vanessa wanted. She wanted me humiliated, exposed as a fraud who couldn't hack the business side of the industry. I stepped out of the walk-in, shivering slightly, and dialed Lachlan. He was an old salt, a guy who owned a small fleet of independent day boats and supplied the best spot prawns in Dungeness on the coast. He usually didn't take calls after 8 p.m., but he answered for me because we both knew what it felt like to have salt water freeze on your eyelashes. Elias, you need to add to the morning order because the boats are already coming in. Lachlan, I have a problem. I leaned against the prep table, watching Imogen scrub down the flat top. I need my regular Friday order. Actually, I need Friday and Saturday combined. But I can't pay you on terms this week, and I can't cut you a check. Silence on the other end of the line. In the restaurant business, sudden cash flow issues usually meant one thing. The restaurant was dying. Elias, Lachlan said slowly, the warmth completely gone from his gravelly voice. We have an agreement. Net 15. You've never missed a payment. What's going on? You in trouble? A legal issue, I said honestly. I wasn't going to lie to a guy who pulled his living out of the same freezing water I used to work. A former partner is freezing my accounts tomorrow morning to force a settlement. It's a shakedown. My lawyer is on it, but it might take a week or two to clear. The money is there, Lachlan. I just can't access it. I have $4,000 in cash to give you tomorrow. The rest, I need you to float me on a handshake. Lachlan sighed, a heavy, tired sound that crackled through the phone speaker. You know how tight my margins are right now with diesel prices. If you go under, and I'm left holding the bag for 2 days of premium catch, I won't go under, I said. My voice was harder now, the crabbing boat grit bleeding through the polished chef exterior. You know me, Lachlan. You know what I survived on the Faro. I didn't build this place to let a lawyer from Bellevue tear it down because of a loophole. I will pay you. Every cent. He was quiet for a long time. I could hear the faint sound of seagulls in the background of his call, the nocturnal harbor sounds of Astoria bleeding through the line. $4,000 cash on delivery, Lachlan finally said. And you owe me a favor. A big one. Done. The truck will be there at 10 am. Don't make me regret this, Elias. I hung up. One disaster averted. But I still had to deal with the produce, the linen company, and the hardest part, my staff. I called everyone into the dining room. Imogen, Crispin, the dishwashers, the line cooks. 11 people in total. They stood around the custom oak table, looking tired, wanting to go home, but sensing the tension in my posture. I'm not going to sugarcoat this, I started, looking at each of them. The ambient lighting was turned down, casting long shadows across their faces. Tomorrow morning, our primary business accounts are going to be frozen by a court order. It's a malicious legal action from a third party trying to leverage equity they don't own. We will win, but it means our cash flow is completely choked off starting at 9 am. The silence in the room was heavy. Crispin, who had a mortgage and a newborn at home, looked sick. He shifted his weight, looking down at his polished shoes. Your payroll is scheduled to draft on Sunday, I continued. It will fail if the freeze isn't lifted by then. I am telling you this now because I respect you, and you deserve the truth. If you need to walk out that door tonight and find another kitchen, I will write you a glowing letter of recommendation, and I will personally pay your final wages out of my own pocket the second this is over. No hard feelings. Imogen crossed her arms. Are we closing? No, I said instantly, leaving no room for doubt. We have enough product secured secured for the weekend. We are going to open the doors, we are going to cook the best food in the city, and we are going to show the people trying to bleed us dry that we don't break. I looked at Crispin. If anyone needs emergency cash for groceries or rent this weekend, come to me privately. I have a small personal emergency fund I can tap into, but for the business, we are flying on fumes. Nobody moved toward the door. Imogen looked around the room, making eye contact with the younger cooks, then back at me. Chef, she said quietly, we're not going anywhere. We built this line. We're going to hold it. There were nods around the room, a collective tightening of aprons. I felt a hard knot form in my throat, but I swallowed it down. This wasn't the time for emotion. It was time to work the problem. All right, I said. Go home. Get some sleep. Tomorrow, we prep for a war. They filed out one by one, leaving me alone in the empty restaurant. The silence was absolute. I walked over to the massive wood-fired grill in the center of the open kitchen. The embers were still glowing dull red beneath a thick layer of ash, throwing a faint, localized heat against my forearms. I stood there for a long time, staring into the dying coals. Vanessa thought she had me boxed in. She thought I was just the same guy she could kick out of a townhouse with 48 hours notice. She fundamentally misunderstood what the last 4 years had done to me. She broke my heart, sure, but the ocean had broken my body, and I had rebuilt it stronger. I survived 20-hour shifts in freezing rain. A legal freeze was just another storm. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text message this time. Unknown number. Check your personal checking account. Sleep well. I frowned, a cold prickle of unease washing down the back of my neck. I opened the banking app on my phone. I logged into my personal Chase account, the one completely separate from the business LLC, the one I had opened in Astoria with my very first crabbing paycheck. The balance was supposed to be around $12,000, a modest safety net. It was what I was planning to use to float Crispin and anyone else who needed rent money this weekend. I stared at the glowing screen in the dim kitchen. The balance read 0 cents. There was a pending transaction at the very top of the ledger, a massive withdrawal, initiated by a direct routing number transfer, tagged with a legal code I didn't recognize. They hadn't just filed against Iron and Brine, they had pierced the corporate veil entirely. Trask had somehow convinced a night judge that my personal funds were intrinsically linked to the disputed educational investment, executing a total asset freeze across every account bearing my social security number. I had no personal emergency fund. I had no safety net for Crispin's rent. I had absolutely nothing. Vanessa hadn't just cornered me. She had poured gasoline on the floor and locked the doors. I stood in the dark kitchen for 20 minutes, the blue light of my phone screen casting a pale glow over the stainless steel prep tables. $0. She hadn't just gone after the business. She had gone after the man. I hit Bowen's number again. It was almost 11 at night. He answered on the first ring, and I could hear the background noise of a quiet bar. Elias, he said, sounding exhausted. Tell me you aren't looking at your personal accounts. They're gone, Bowen. Everything. The Chase account, the savings, the emergency fund. Zeroed out. Bowen cursed softly. Trask, he filed an ex parte motion for a temporary restraining order on your assets. He argued an alter ego theory, basically telling a night judge that because you used personal funds to build the restaurant, there is no separation between Elias the man and Iron and Brine the LLC. He claimed you were an immediate flight risk with liquid assets. I have a lease, a staff, and a restaurant that's booked out for 6 months, I said, my voice dangerously tight. How am I a flight risk? Because you lived in Astoria for 3 years working on a boat, Bowen replied flatly. Trask painted you as a transient who could pull up stakes and disappear back to the coast with Vanessa's rightful equity. It's a textbook bad faith filing, Elias. Any decent judge will see right through it and quash the injunction. When? Monday morning. I'll be waiting at the clerk's office at 8 a.m. Bowen, I have a massive Friday and Saturday service. I have no money. I have $4,000 in a metal box in the back office, and I owe all of it to a fisherman who is driving a truck up from Oregon right now. If I can't buy food, I can't open. If I can't open, the rumors start. The critics hear about it. The investors hear about it. Do not move money from anywhere else, Bowen warned. Don't borrow from a friend and deposit it. Don't take a cash advance on a credit card. Trask is watching the ledger. If you introduce outside capital, he'll argue you're commingling hidden assets. Run the restaurant on whatever physical cash you have on the premises. Barter if you have to. Just survive until Monday. I hung up. I didn't go back to my loft. I couldn't bear the thought of sitting in that beautiful empty space overlooking the water, knowing it was technically frozen by the man who had helped throw me onto the street 4 years ago. Instead, I went into the tiny office, pulled 2 clean chef's aprons off the shelf, balled them up, and lay down on the concrete floor behind the desk. It was hard, and it was cold. It reminded me of the basement in Tacoma, but this time, I wasn't crying over a lost marriage. I was calculating exactly how much alder wood I had left in the alleyway shed. Friday morning hit like a freight train. At 6:00 a.m., the kitchen lights flicked on, blinding me. Imogen was standing in the doorway, holding 2 massive cups of black coffee. She looked down at me on the floor, then nudged my shoe with her boot. Get up, chef. The produce drop is in 20 minutes. I groaned, every joint in my body aching, and took the coffee. It was scalding and bitter, exactly what I needed. I washed my face in the tiny employee restroom, slapped my cheeks, and walked out to the loading dock at the back of the restaurant. Crispin was already there, looking pale. He was holding a clipboard, checking our linen inventory. The truck from Skagit Valley is pulling up, Crispin said, not looking at me. But we have a problem. What kind of problem? The laundry service, Crispin said, tapping his pen against the clipboard. They usually auto-draft the weekly invoice on Friday mornings before they deliver the clean linens. The draft bounced. The driver just called me. He says his dispatcher won't let him drop off the clean aprons, napkins, and tablecloths until the balance is cleared. He's skipping our stop. I rubbed the back of my neck. We used heavy, dark blue linen napkins. It was a signature part of the table setting. Without them, we'd be handing James Beard voters paper towels. How many dirty ones do we have? I asked. 3 bags full from Wednesday and Thursday, Crispin said. Load them into your trunk. We're going to a laundromat. Crispin stared at me. Chef, we have 140 covers tonight. We don't have time to sit at a coin op in Ballard. We don't have a choice, I said. Take petty cash from the register. The coins, not the bills. Buy industrial detergent. Get it done. I'll handle the produce. The farm truck backed up to the dock. The driver, a young kid named Arlo, who usually just dropped the crates and ran, stood by the liftgate holding an invoice. Hey, Elias, Arlo said, looking uncomfortable. My boss said I need a card swipe today. Something about the account on file getting flagged. I walked up to the edge of the dock. Arlo, tell your boss I'm transitioning banks and the routing numbers got crossed. I'll cut him a certified check on Monday with a 20% inconvenience bonus. Leave the crates. Arlo shifted his weight. He said no card, no drop. I looked at the crates of heirloom tomatoes, the fresh microgreens, the wild foraged mushrooms I desperately needed for the halibut pilot setup. I needed that food. Call him, I said. Arlo pulled out his phone, dialed, and handed it to me. This is Elias, I said into the receiver. I need my drop. I need my money, the farmer snapped. I don't run a charity, Elias. You know how tight things are. I know, but if you pull that truck away, you lose a buyer who spends $3,000 a week with you. I'm good for it on Monday. I'll add 20%. Rumor on the supply chain is you're getting sued into the ground by your ex-wife. I gripped the phone tight enough to crack the casing. Trask, he hadn't just filed the paperwork, he had leaked it to the supply chain to panic my vendors. It was a deliberate strategy to choke off my operations before I could even get to court. The rumor is garbage, I lied, my voice perfectly steady. It's a nuisance suit that gets dismissed on Monday. But if you take those crates back, I find a new farm on Tuesday. Silence on the line. Then, a heavy sigh. 20%, Elias, or I never sell to you again. Done. I handed the phone back to Arlo. He nodded, dropped the liftgate, and started pushing the hand truck into the kitchen. We were prepping the vegetables when Lachlan's refrigerated truck rumbled down the alleyway at exactly 10:00 am. I wiped my hands on my towel, went into the office, and unlocked the heavy iron safe under the desk. Inside was a stack of bills, mostly 20s and 50s from cash-paying customers over the last month. I counted out $4,000. It was a thick, messy stack of paper. It represented literally everything I had left in the world. I walked out to the alley. Lachlan was standing by the back doors of his truck, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette. He looked me up and down, taking in the dark circles under my eyes. You look like hell, Elias. I feel great, I said, handing him the stack of cash. Lachlan didn't even count it. He shoved it into his thick canvas jacket pocket. The whole coast is talking. Kid, people are saying you leveraged yourself out, that the venture capital guys pulled out last night and the bank called your notes. It's a legal freeze from an ex-father-in-law, I said, grabbing the first heavy plastic tote of Dungeness crab. The ice was freezing against my palms, a familiar, comforting sting. It gets sorted Monday. I hope so, Lachlan said, grabbing the other side of the tote. Because I brought you the spot prawns, but the halibut boat diverted to a buyer in Portland when they heard your accounts were locked. I couldn't stop them. I froze. No halibut? None. I brought you black cod instead. Best I could do on short notice. Black cod. It's a beautiful fish, fatty and rich, but it cooks entirely differently than halibut. My entire Friday menu was built around a pan-seared halibut with a Meyer lemon and foraged mushroom broth. Black cod would turn to mush in that preparation. It needed high heat, a hard sear, a completely different flavor profile. I had exactly 4 hours to rewrite the centerpiece of my tasting menu and prep it for 140 people. Thanks, Lachlan, I said, taking the tote. I owe you. Just survive the weekend, he muttered, climbing back into his cab. I dragged the seafood into the kitchen. Imogen was breaking down a lamb shoulder at the prep station. I dropped the tote on the stainless steel table. Change of plans, I called out, my voice echoing off the brick walls. We lost the halibut. We have black cod. Imogen, scrap the mushroom broth. We're doing a smoked soy and charred scallion glaze. Hard sear on the wood fire. Get the younger cooks breaking down the cod right now. Check for pin bones twice. If a guest chokes on a bone tonight, we're finished. The kitchen shifted gears seamlessly. That's the beauty of a good crew. They don't panic, they just pivot. For the next 3 hours, it was a blur of knives, fire, and shouting. The smell of rendering fat and burning alder wood filled the space. I tasted the new glaze, adjusted the acidity, tasted it again. It was aggressive, bold. It was better than the halibut. At 2:00 p.m., Crispin walked through the back door, carrying 3 massive plastic trash bags over his shoulders. He looked completely defeated. He smelled strongly of cheap floral laundry detergent. I sat in a laundromat next to a guy trimming his toenails for 3 hours, Crispin said, dropping the bags on the floor. But the napkins are clean. Get them ironed and folded, I said, plating a test portion of the cod. Service in 3 hours. At 4:30 p.m., the kitchen was spotless. The stations were stocked. The fire was roaring, casting a fierce orange glow across the line. The front of house staff was in the dining room, folding Crispin's freshly laundered napkins, setting the heavy silverware on the bare oak tables. The ambient lighting was dialed in. I was standing at the pass, drinking a glass of ice water, letting the adrenaline settle into my system. We were ready. Then the front door opened. It wasn't a guest. It was a man in his late 20s, wearing a sharp, tailored blue suit that screamed Bellevue money. He carried a leather briefcase and had the kind of aggressive, arrogant posture that instantly put my teeth on edge. He didn't stop at the host stand. He walked right through the empty dining room, his leather shoes clicking loudly on the hardwood, and stopped directly in front of the open kitchen pass. Elias Ravenswood? He asked. We open at 5, I said, not moving. I'm not here for dinner, the man said, pulling a thick manila envelope from his briefcase. My name is Stellan. I'm a junior associate at Trask & Associates. I have a secondary filing for you, and a formal demand for an on-site inventory. The kitchen went dead silent. Imogen stopped wiping down her cutting board. Crispin, who was adjusting a wine glass on a table nearby, froze. An inventory? I asked. Pursuant to the temporary restraining order, Stellan said, sliding the envelope across the stainless steel pass. My client has a vested 15% equity interest in this establishment. Given your highly irregular banking activity late last night, we have reason to believe you are liquidating assets or transferring funds off the books. I am here to conduct a physical count of the inventory and audit the safe. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small digital camera. I stared at him. It was a deliberate provocation. Vanessa and Trask knew I was opening in 30 minutes. They sent this kid here to walk through my kitchen, take pictures of my food, and humiliate me in front of my staff right before the most critical service of my life. You aren't coming in my kitchen, I said quietly. I have a court order, Stellan said, stepping toward the swinging doors. If you obstruct me, I will call the police and have you arrested for violating a judicial mandate. The court order froze my bank accounts, I said, stepping sideways to block the doors. It did not grant you operational authority, nor did it grant you a warrant to search my premises. I know exactly what an ex parte covers, Stellan. It covers paper. It doesn't cover my walk-in. Stellan's arrogant smirk faltered for a second, but he recovered quickly. If you refuse the audit, we will amend the complaint on Monday to include destruction of evidence and obstruction. Do whatever you want on Monday, I said, leaning over the pass until I was inches from his face. But right now, you are standing in a commercial kitchen without non-slip shoes, a hairnet, or a food handler's permit. That is a health code violation. Get out of my restaurant. Stellan flushed red. He looked past me, making eye contact with Imogen, who was glaring at him with a paring knife still in her hand. He looked at the massive roaring fire behind me. He was out of his element, and he knew it. I'm leaving the notice, Stellan said, tapping the envelope on the counter. You have been served, and just so you know, Vanessa sends her regards. She says to tell you that you should have pushed her app through. He turned on his heel and walked out, his pace much faster than when he entered. I picked up the envelope. I didn't even open it. I walked over to the wood-fired grill and tossed the thick packet of legal threats directly onto the hottest part of the coals. The paper curled, blackened, and burst into bright orange flames. All right, listen up, I said, turning back to the crew. They were all staring at me. The people trying to take this place want us to fail tonight. They want the food to be sloppy. They want the service to be distracted. They want us broken. We don't break. I tied my apron tighter. Doors open in 10 minutes. Let's cook. The Friday service was a bloodbath in the best possible way. The dining room filled up instantly. The noise level rose to a dull roar. The sound of clinking glasses, laughter, and money. We pushed out the black cod, plate after plate. The smoke from the wood fire coated my skin, my clothes, my hair. We worked with a synchronized, brutal efficiency. Every time I plated a dish, I thought about the zero balance in my account, and I pushed harder. I demanded perfection from the line. By 11 p.m., the last ticket was stabbed onto the spindle. The kitchen was a wreck of dirty pans and empty prep containers, but we had done it. We hadn't run out of food. No one sent a plate back. I was standing at the back sink, drinking a quart container of ice water, when Crispin walked in. He looked completely drained. Register is closed, Crispin said, handing me the printed receipt tape. We did $22,000 in gross sales tonight, and not a single cent of it goes to our account until Monday, I said, looking at the number. It was a cruel joke. We were making money hand over fist, and we were completely broke. Chef, Imogen said, walking over from her station. She had changed into her street clothes, a heavy denim jacket. I need to show you something. She held out her phone. It was open to a local Seattle hospitality forum, a message board where cooks, bartenders, and managers gossip. There was a new thread, posted 2 hours ago, right in the middle of our service. The title read, Iron and Brine owner Elias Ravenswood embroiled in fraud lawsuit. Doors closing next week. I took the phone. The post detailed the exact nature of the asset freeze. It claimed I had stolen the seed money for the restaurant from my ex-wife. It claimed vendors were cutting me off. It was a character assassination, perfectly constructed to destroy my credit with suppliers and my reputation with the public. Who posted it? I asked, though I already knew. Anonymous account, Imogen said. But it's getting shared. A food writer for the Seattle Met just retweeted it. Vanessa wasn't just trying to win a legal settlement. She was systematically destroying my life. She wanted me back in the damp basement in Tacoma. I handed the phone back to Imogen. Go home, get some rest. We do it all again tomorrow. They left. I locked the doors. I turned off the lights. I walked back into the tiny office and looked at the metal safe. It was completely empty. I had no cash left. I had a Saturday service looming, and the entire city was waking up to a rumor that I was a fraud. I sat down on the floor behind the desk, pulled my knees to my chest, and waited for the sun to come up. The sun finally broke through the gray Seattle overcast around 6, casting a pale, cold light across the concrete floor of the office. My back was stiff, my neck aching, but the panic from the night before had burned away, leaving only a cold, hard resolve. We pushed through Saturday service, fueled by nothing but spite and adrenaline. Every seat was filled. Some guests looked at me differently, whispering behind their linen napkins, clearly having read the anonymous forum post. I didn't care. The food was flawless. By midnight on Saturday, we had generated another $25,000 in untouchable revenue, and I had exactly $42 in loose change left in the metal safe. We were closed on Sundays. I spent the entire day sitting in the dark, silent dining room, drinking black coffee and watching the rain hit the massive front windows. Monday morning, I put on my best tailored suit, the one I had bought for the James Beard nomination dinner, and walked into the King County Courthouse at exactly 7:45 a.m. Bowen was already there, standing by the metal detectors. He looked incredibly calm, holding a single thin manila folder. He didn't offer a pep talk. He just nodded, handed me a coffee, and walked me toward the elevators. Judge Morrow's chamber, Bowen said as the doors closed. She's fair, but she hates having her time wasted, and she absolutely despises ex parte filings used as weapons. Let me do all the talking. We walked into the small hearing room. Richard Trask was already seated at the petitioner's table. He looked exactly like the kind of man who would legally evict his son in Law 40, 8 hours before Thanksgiving. Silver hair, perfectly styled, a bespoke charcoal suit, and a gold Rolex that cost more than my first year's salary on the crabbing boat. Vanessa sat next to him. She looked pale and tightly wound, but when she saw me walk in, that familiar entitled smirk flickered across her face. She leaned over and whispered something to her father. Trask didn't even look at me. He just slowly unscrewed the cap of his expensive fountain pen. Judge Morrow walked in exactly at 8 a.m. She was a woman in her late 50s with sharp, tired eyes. She sat down, opened the thick file on her desk, and let out a heavy sigh that echoed in the quiet room. All right, Judge Morrow said, not looking up. I'm looking at an emergency temporary restraining order placed on both the business and personal accounts of one Elias Ravenswood, filed Friday afternoon by Mr. Trask on behalf of his client. The claim here is commingling of assets and immediate flight risk tied to a disputed 15% equity stake. Mr. Trask, you froze this man's entire operational liquidity going into a weekend service. You better have a smoking gun. Trask stood up, buttoning his jacket. Your Honor, the dissolution of assets signed 4 years ago clearly stipulates my client's right to 15% of any food service enterprise established within 5 years as consideration for her financial investment in his culinary education. Mr. Ravenswood has repeatedly denied her this equity. Furthermore, given his history of transient employment, working undocumented on commercial fishing vessels, and his sudden influx of capital, we had credible fear he would liquidate the restaurant's assets and flee the jurisdiction. Undocumented? Bowen stood up, his voice calm but sharp. Your Honor, my client worked as a W-2 employee on a registered commercial vessel for 3 years. His tax returns are in the folder I just handed the clerk. There is nothing transient about it. He built a brick-and-mortar restaurant with a 5-year commercial lease. Judge Morrow flipped through the folder. I see the W-2s. Move on, Mr. Bowen. Your Honor, Bowen continued, stepping out from behind our table. The ex parte filing was not just an overreach. It was a deliberate, malicious attempt to bankrupt my client before he could even defend himself. And the foundation of their claim, the educational investment, is entirely fabricated. Trask scoffed loudly. We have the signed addendum, Your Honor. The language is explicit. The language is explicit, Bowen agreed, turning to look directly at Vanessa. It states equity is owed for culinary training paid for by the petitioner prior to the dissolution. But my client never attended culinary school. The only training he received during their marriage was a $300 food safety certification. Bowen walked over to the clerk and handed over a single piece of paper. That is a bank statement from 4.5 years ago, Bowen said, his voice echoing in the small room, showing the $300 charge to the community college, paid for by a debit card ending in 4421, an account solely in the name of Elias Ravenswood. Vanessa never paid a single cent toward his education. Vanessa's smirk vanished. She looked at her father, panic flashing in her eyes. Trask's jaw tightened. Your Honor, the spirit of the agreement, Trask started. I don't care about the spirit, Mr. Trask. I care about the letter, Judge Morrow snapped, looking at the bank statement. But we aren't done, Bowen said, his voice dropping into a lethal, quiet register. Because in the process of reviewing the original dissolution of assets, I noticed a discrepancy regarding the joint savings account. $34,200 claimed by the petitioner as recouped living expenses in the final decree. I watched Vanessa physically shrink in her chair. I subpoenaed the wire transfers from that joint account, Your Honor, Bowen continued. 3 weeks before the divorce was filed, Vanessa Trask wired that exact amount to a corporate entity known as Apex Luxury Rentals, a company owned by her then paramour, which was recently liquidated by the SEC in a highly publicized bankruptcy for operating as a Ponzi scheme. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear the hum of the HVAC system in the ceiling. Under Washington state law, Bowen said, turning back to the judge, dissipating marital assets to fund a third party's business prior to a legal separation without the spouse's consent is marital fraud. The petitioner breached the good faith foundation of the divorce agreement before the ink was even dry. The non-compete equity clause isn't just factually baseless. The entire contract is compromised by her prior fraud. Judge Morrow slowly took off her reading glasses. She looked at Trask. Trask was staring straight ahead, his face completely devoid of color. He was a shark, but he wasn't stupid. He knew when he was bleeding in the water. He hadn't known about the Ponzi scheme wire transfer. Vanessa had lied to him too, Mr. Trask, Judge Morrow said, her voice dangerously quiet. Did you use my court to file an ex parte asset freeze on a business, knowing your client committed marital fraud with the very funds she claimed to be protecting? Your Honor, I was not aware. Save it, the judge interrupted. She grabbed her gavel. The temporary restraining order is dissolved immediately. All accounts, business and personal, are to be unfrozen by the banks by 10 no-am today. Furthermore, I am dismissing the petitioner's claim to any equity in Iron and Brine with prejudice. You cannot refile this garbage in my court. She looked at Bowen. Mr. Bowen, if your client wishes to pursue civil damages for the revenue lost this weekend due to this malicious filing, you will have a very receptive audience in this chamber. We are adjourned. The gavel hit the sound block with a sharp crack. I didn't cheer. I didn't smile. I just stood up, buttoned my jacket, and looked at Vanessa. She was still sitting at the table, her hands trembling in her lap. Her father was already packing his briefcase, aggressively shoving papers inside without looking at her. He leaned down and whispered something vicious in her ear, then turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving her entirely alone. I walked out with Bowen. The hallway was bright and loud with the morning court rush. I'll get the dissolution orders to the banks right now, Bowen said, checking his watch. The money will be accessible before lunch. Go pay your fisherman, Elias. Thank you, Bowen. He clapped my shoulder and walked away toward the clerk's office. I stood by the elevators, waiting for the doors to open. A few seconds later, footsteps echoed behind me. I didn't turn around. Elias. Vanessa's voice was thin, completely stripped of its usual armor. I pressed the elevator button and watched the floor indicator light up. He's going to make me pay him back for the legal fees, she said, her voice catching. My dad, he's furious. And the house is gone, Elias. The bank is foreclosing next week. I have nowhere to go. The elevator chimed. The metal doors slid open, revealing an empty, mirrored cab. You should have let the CIA let her go, I said, stepping into the elevator. I was scared, she whispered, tears finally spilling over her mascara. I was scared you would leave me behind if you became something. I turned around and looked at her one last time. The woman who had taken my money, my home, and my future, standing in a courthouse hallway with absolutely nothing left. I was never going to leave you, Vanessa, I said quietly. You threw me away. I reached out and pressed the button for the lobby. The doors slid shut, cutting off the sight of her crying in the hallway, and I felt a physical weight lift off my chest, a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for 4 years. By noon, the bank accounts were live. I was sitting in my tiny, kelp-smelling office. The first thing I did was wire Lachlan his $4,000, plus a flat 20% inconvenience fee. Then I paid the Skagit Valley farm. Then I paid the linen company. I authorized the payroll. I walked out of the office and saw Crispin standing by the host stand, looking at his phone. He looked up, a massive, relieved smile breaking across his face. The direct deposits had hit. At 4 p.m., the prep line was humming. Imogen was breaking down a massive whole halibut that Lachlan had managed to get on an early boat just for us. The wood fire was roaring in the center of the room, the smell of alder wood and rendering fat filling the air. The front door opened, and Arthur walked in. He wasn't wearing a suit today, just a thick wool sweater. The restaurant was still closed to the public for another hour. He walked over to the pass and leaned against the stainless steel counter. I saw the anonymous forum post, Arthur said casually, watching Imogen fillet the fish. Did some digging over the weekend. Trask is a nasty piece of work. It's handled, I said, wiping down my station. The injunction is dead. The equity is mine. Arthur smiled. I figured. I also figured you might have had a tight weekend. So, I took the liberty of reaching out to a few friends at the Seattle Met and the local business journals. They're going to run a piece tomorrow about Iron and Brine's resilience and maybe drop a few heavily researched hints about a certain Bellevue lawyer filing frivolous, bad faith injunctions. The anonymous rumor is already dead. I stopped wiping the counter and looked at him. You didn't have to do that. I protect my investments, Arthur said smoothly. And frankly, I respect a man who can take a punch like that and still serve a flawless black cod. We still on for Thursday night? Your usual table, I said. Arthur nodded, tapped the counter, and walked out. I tied a clean, bright white apron around my waist. I looked around my kitchen, the stainless steel gleaming under the warm copper lights, the crew moving in perfect silent synchronicity, the massive hearth throwing heat against my face. It was mine, all of it. I grabbed my tongs, turned toward the fire, and got to work.